Why did you make me do this? You're fighting so you can watch everyone around you die!
Think, Mark! You'll outlast every fragile, insignificant being on this planet. You'll live to see this world crumble to dust and blow away! Everyone and everything you know will be gone! What will you have after 500 years?
You, Dad. I still have you.
So I compared Steven Universe to Invincible online. I love the animated series Invincible, the one about the child of a superhuman being from outer space having to deal with their parents' consequences despite having innate power thrust upon them. No, Invincible. A lot of people took it incredibly personally. Many people took it upon themselves to let me know that Invincible is a comic that is 23 years old because it was first released in 2003. So many people let me know. It's clear that many people thought I was somehow insinuating Invincible copied Steven Universe, which, given the nature of both fandoms, I honestly don't know what I expected interacting with either of them online. At the same time, I didn't say that. I think it's pretty clear I was just poking fun at some coincidental similarities. But this is the internet, so maybe I should have known better. I'd also, again, forgotten what two fandoms I was invoking, so that's on me. Because I was there back in the day in the trenches. I was in the Steven Universe fandom on iFunny back in the day. But I was a little too busy looking at pictures and fan art of buff Jasper to be really worrying about everything else going on in the fandom at the time. So all that to say, I know ball. A lot of people were also really impassioned by the fact that Invincible is apparently just Dragon Ball Z, which in my lifetime, I've seen maybe a combined 10 minutes total of Dragon Ball Z, from watching it over my dad's shoulder when he was watching it in the living room. Hay algo en Dragon Ball Z con lo latino, pero no asunto mío. So anyways, here's the thing. I am correct. I am correct that these two shows, Invincible, Steven Universe, are eerily similar. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying one copied the other. I fear literacy rates are so low, people forget that the whole point of thematic analysis between pieces of work is to find through lines between seemingly unrelated texts, or in this case, shows. Despite the fact that a simple similarity was observed, half the comments actually'd themselves into the ground because nobody thought for more than a few seconds that comparison between works can be used as a tool for learning and observing, surprisingly enough. Somebody needs to get y'all a DBQ stat. We need to exercise those brains a little, okay? And I'm being lighthearted about it because of course, person surprised that posting opinion on the internet somehow riles people up. I'm fully aware that somehow I was shocked at a response to an Instagram reel of all things. So I'm really not actually taking it that seriously. People who are spending time critically analyzing, work for fun, I don't think are also spending their time fighting with people on Instagram reel comments. But I was a little bit surprised, I will say, that, the majority of people who commented under that video jumped to the conclusion that because two stories share similarities, that automatically means that we as consumers of those stories have to pick a better option, as opposed to instead finding what blends them together thematically. The beauty and curse of humanity is that we, collective humans, are deeply habitual creatures. And that includes the stories that we tell. Storytelling is almost always only about 5 or 6 or 8 different things, depending on who you ask. And in my opinion, most of those things could probably be categorized under sex, love, pain, and death. People are very deeply creative and we are constantly coming up with new work, but more often than not, what that work is about is kind of just a recloaking and retelling of the same human stories that we tell over and over again. It's why things like Shakespeare and Greek theater are so timeless and still stick around to this day. And I love this. Like, this is not a complaint of mine. I love this about storytelling. I love this about people. All that to say, yes, I am about to spend, as we speak, a currently undefinable amount of time talking about why the show about the emotional alien space kid with daddy issues is like the other show about the emotional alien space kid with mommy issues. And you're going to sit there and enjoy it because you either like both of these shows and, you want to watch a video about them, or you're like me and you watch YouTube video essays about topics you know absolutely nothing about while you're like folding laundry or cooking dinner. That was how I discovered Kevin Perjurer. He has my whole entire heart and he takes up the majority of my YouTube search history. However, before we begin, while you and I get to sit here and indulge in fantastical stories of love and loss and hardship, there are very real and very dangerous and unjust hardships occurring in our world around us as I speak, as you watch this. Even when I put out work that may be seemingly unrelated to these topics, it is still my responsibility as a person of conscience to bring them up as much as I possibly can at every opportunity. What I'm referring to in this case is Palestine, specifically the fact that despite the fact that mainstream media coverage has conveniently seemed to have decided it's done caring and covering the Palestinian people, they are still most certainly experiencing and it really sucks that I can't say that word out loud, I don't think, but to my understanding, videos that include it are not boosted in the algorithm. So unfortunately, I am self-censoring for a moment here. I'm normally not one to block or limit what I'm speaking about. Very recently, unfortunately, a turn of events has escalated the situation in Palestine being Is Not Real's new death penalty law, as well as a recent attack on the flotillas that were on their way there to provide aid. Ugh, that's how I feel about you, Netan. I'm being incredibly calm and collected as I describe this here in this moment. But make no mistake, this is devastating to witness. It's an absolutely abhorrent crime against life and humanity in itself. And while there are things that I do off the internet to advocate for this kind of thing, on the internet, I'm going to be directing you to a link in the description of this video towards the Samir Project. If you have the funds, I highly encourage you to donate. Doesn't matter if I'm hopping online and talking about something in comparison as seemingly minuscule as Steven Universe. No matter what kind of art we create, no matter what we do in our free time, no matter what kind of person we are, we should be taking time out of our day to advocate for these people and, above all else, to advocate for the rights of humans everywhere. And there's really no easy way for me to move on and transition from speaking about this. Like, there's no natural seam into, like, let's start the video now. And frankly, I don't want there to be a natural transition because what's happening to the Palestinian people is not natural. It's not seamless. It shouldn't be easy to transition away from. So I will just leave it here that you have heard what I have to say. You should check out the link in my bio. Viva Palestina para siempre. No matter the creative work you're doing, you for damn sure better make the time and space for those who do not have the liberty at this moment in time to focus on things like YouTube video essays and the show Invincible. Now, with all that being said, let's jump into it so I can continue to piss off even more people on the internet. And if you think we can, we'll always... I would like to say from this point on, spoilers for all seasons of Invincible, including the most recent one that just came out, and spoilers for all seasons, movies, sub-series of Steven Universe. So in case you didn't hear it the first 20 gazillion times, everybody let me know. Invincible is a comic that originally came out in 2003. It was written by Robert Kirkman, illustrated by Cory Walker and Ryan Ottley. It has a total of 144 issues. I've never read any of them, but I am of the understanding that the TV show is pretty true to form to the comics, aside from like changing things that perhaps didn't particularly age well, or them, making alterations now that they are fully fledged adults and perhaps have differing opinions than they did at the time of writing. Because of this, though, from this moment on in the video, I am only referring to Invincible, the animated series, as I've seen the show and I have not read the comics, and I'm comparing two shows to one another. While I do understand that it is important to view works, as a collective, I do understand there's merit and value in referencing Invincible as a whole. For the sake of this conversation, it's not particularly relevant, and I'm only focusing on the show. So if you've never seen Invincible, no worries. And if you have seen Invincible, also no worries, because this video is not a giant plot summary. I'm actually going to go somewhere with this. But let's just go over a brief review of a general focus on the main plot and the show's protagonist. Invincible follows Mark Grayson. He's the son of Debbie, who is a human, and Nolan, or Omni-Man. Nolan is part of an alien species called Viltrumites, who are generally known to be, according to the Invincible fandom wiki, a highly advanced alien race of extremely powerful superhumanoids from the planet Viltrum. They are known and feared across the galaxy as a merciless, militaristic civilization that tirelessly seeks universal supremacy. So essentially, the Viltrumites are space Nazis. Invincible's two main big themes, in my opinion, are basically the most classic hero stories you could get when it comes to stories about aliens and superhumans. One main theme of the show is the burden and responsibility of power, shown through Mark having to navigate being a superhero while also trying to maintain some sense of young adult normalcy in his life. Unconsensually, as Mark did not ask to be born, Mark has thrust upon him near immortality. I say near because, as far as I can tell, the implication is Viltrumites can live for thousands upon thousands of years, and they're near indestructible. Dare I say, So despite Mark trying to balance at least a somewhat human life, which includes friendships, romantic relationships, a relationship with his family, he also has to grapple with the fact that he's destined to eventually lose everything and everyone he knows and loves over and over and over again. Mark grapples with his humanity by sticking to a no-kill rule, believing he can reason, or at the very least, beat the shit out of, but not quite destroy the enemies that he faces. And this rule eventually does face some leeway, but that's the nature of his struggle, him being pushed to his limits to abide by his original no-kill rule. So if we are to sum it up in its simplest terms, the first major theme of the show is encompassed by Mark, and it is the burden of power balanced with the desire to maintain humanity above all else. We're going to call this theme struggling to remain human. The second major theme of the show is represented through Nolan, who, at least at the very beginning, hates humanity. Nolan initially traveled to Earth and procreated with a human with the intent of conquering the planet and bolstering the Viltrumite race. Nolan spends much of the show incredibly cold, callous, indifferent towards life. His superhero persona is at first kind of just an elaborate facade to gain the trust of the planet, and at one point he even confesses throughout their marriage he merely saw his wife as a pet, something people like to quote a lot. However, over time, this mentality began to unravel because once Nolan got to know humanity, specifically through his son, he realizes his emotions towards life, power, and humans, they've become more complex than he thought. This results in his home species and planet feeling betrayed, and this disdain from his home world only serves as a catalyst to continue to push Nolan towards learning how to respect, appreciate, and eventually care for the humanity of others. So, to sum it up, the second major theme of the show is encompassed by Nolan, human, and it is an undoing of systemic beliefs rooted in power, balanced with a slow, inevitable appreciation for life and humanity. We will call this theme struggling to become human. So, in essence, two major themes of the show: struggling to remain human and struggling to become human. I'd like to say here that when I say struggling to become human or struggling to remain human, I mean the word human more as a metaphorical or philosophical battle, as opposed to the literal meaning of like becoming the species of creature known as human. Other things happen, which we will get into later. I am severely oversimplifying the show. But my main point here is Invincible is, in my opinion, above all else, a show about what it means to be human. The show is also an exploration as to how we, as people, often wildly and rapidly oscillate throughout ourselves between either feeling too human, too raw, too vulnerable, which can feel like an incredible burden, or we feel not human enough compared to everyone else, which can feel like a painful, slow lesson that no one provides you the instructions for. It's a really good show. I enjoyed watching it. I've watched the show twice now, and I've cried and been as emotionally impacted as the first time that I watched it. And that's why Invincible is... If you've never seen Steven Universe, no worries. If you have seen it, no worries, because this video is not just going to be one big giant plot summary. I'm going somewhere with this, but just a brief overview of a general focus on the main plot and its protagonist. Steven Universe follows Steven Universe, who is the son of Greg, a human, and Rose Quartz, or Pink Diamond. Rose is an alien species called gems, who are generally known to be, according to the Steven Universe fandom wiki, an extraterrestrial species of magical, roughly humanoid beings from a planet referred to as Homeworld. Gems can be quote-unquote regular gems like pearls, amethysts, rubies, etc., or two or more gems can fuse together to become fusions, basically a new, separate person with the memories, emotions, and powers of the gems who fused to make them. Gems on Homeworld are ruled by the diamonds, the most powerful form of gem. We know Steven's mom as Rose Quartz, but later on in the series, it's revealed that she is Pink Diamond, one of the diamonds, in disguise. The diamonds enforce strict social constructs. They have an innate belief they are superior to other forms of life that they encounter in the show's context, specifically humans, and quite literally, in their words, work to colonize planets to create more gems.
The diamonds, unique in their flawlessness, sought to expand their perfection across the galaxy. And it was for this purpose that Pink Diamond chose her first colony, the planet Earth.
They do use the word colonize very frequently. So essentially, the diamonds are space Nazis. So Steven Universe's two main big themes are basically the most classic hero stories you could get when it comes to stories about aliens and regular humans. One main theme of the show is the burden and responsibility of power, shown through Steven having to navigate being a gem while also trying to maintain some sense of young teen normalcy in his life. Unconsensually, as Steven did not ask to be born, he has thrust upon him unknown power, including the ability to age at a rate different than humans. So despite Steven trying to balance at least a somewhat normal life, including friendships, romantic relationships, and a relationship with his family, he also has to grapple with the fact that he is destined to eventually lose everything and everyone he knows and loves. Over and over and over again, Steven grapples with his humanity by sticking to a non-violence rule, believing he can reason with, or at the very least temporarily subdue, in the case of this show, temporarily subdue is by bubbling the enemies that he faces until he can figure out what to do next. This rule later faces some leeway, but That's the nature of Steven's struggle, him being pushed to his limits to abide by his nonviolence rule. So to sum it up, the first major theme of the show, encompassed by Steven, is the burden of power balanced with the desire to maintain humanity above all else. We will call this theme the struggle to remain human. The second major theme of the show is represented through Rose Quartz, who at least at the beginning knows nothing about humanity. Rose initially traveled to Earth mainly due to the fact that she was really bored and discontent with her life as a diamond and found humans to be incredibly amusing and delightful. Rose spends much of the show incredibly aloof and a bit condescending towards life, admittedly mainly because she has not yet learned otherwise. Her Rose Quartz persona is at first just kind of an elaborate facade to avoid the diamonds and better fit in amongst other gems and more importantly fit in amongst humans. However, over time, once Rose got to know humanity specifically through her partner Greg and the desire to have a child with him, she realizes that her emotions towards life, power, and humans, they've become more complex than she originally thought. This results in her learning how to respect, appreciate, and eventually care for the humanity of others, specifically her son's humanity, by giving up her own life, body, and autonomy so Steven can exist through her gemstone. It's a whole other thing that's not really relevant to this video. Rose not being human can't, reproduce a new being from her. So when she quote-unquote gives birth, it's just her, I suppose, fading from existence and Steven becoming the new existence that occupies her gemstone. But anyways, to sum it up, the second major theme of the show, encompassed by Rose, and primarily through all of the other gems, it's an undoing of systemic belief rooted in power, balanced with a slow, inevitable appreciation for life and humanity. We will call this theme struggling to become human. I'd like to point out once again here, when I say struggling to become human or struggling to remain human, I mean the word human is more of a metaphorical or philosophical battle, as opposed to the literal meaning of becoming the species of creature known as human. Other things do happen in the show, but my point here is that primarily Steven Universe is, above all else, a show about what it means to be human. It's an exploration of how we as people often wildly and rapidly oscillate throughout ourselves between either feeling too human, too raw, too vulnerable, which can feel like an incredible burden, or we feel not human enough compared to everyone else, which can feel like a painful, slow lesson that no one provides you the instructions for. It's a pretty good show. I remember enjoying watching it as it came out and crying a lot when I watched the show the first time around.
And I need you to know that every moment you love being yourself, that's me. Loving you and loving being you, because you're going to be something extraordinary.
So here's where I will say I did kind of oversimplify by saying that there were two primary themes between the two of these shows. Struggle to remain human and struggle to become human are absolutely, in my opinion, the largest overarching themes for us as audience members, but for our protagonists themselves, Mark and Steven, their internal struggles are a little bit more specific. You see, despite the fact that Rose Quartz or Omni-Man spends the majority of the show learning how to respect family, for a significantly detrimental portion of it, his egregious acts against humanity before he's learned to value them are absolutely horrible, and they have devastating consequences that last well beyond him being gone. Mark is left to clean up his father's mess, and it sucks. It really, truly, horribly sucks. Steven is not only cleaning up frequently after his mom's actions, all of which took place before he even existed. He's also very often unfairly held accountable for said actions and spends the majority of the show having to convince people that he is not his mother and they're not the same person. With every discovery that Steven makes about this parental figure of his, Steven realizes that he actually kind of can't stand his
I'm not my dad.
dad. Mark fundamentally at his core does not share the same beliefs or moral code as his father, and has to grapple with the fact that Omni-Man is not the person that he thought he was, and in fact is someone antithetical to everything Mark believes in, at least at first. And there are portions of the show later on where Mark discovers that there is a part of him that is able to forgive and understand Omni-Man, but this is a very arduous and challenging journey for Steven to go on. This isn't your usual case of a parental disagreement or your caregiver just not getting you. Omni-Man and Rose Quartz are undeniably, no matter what your opinion is, factually not great people. They are bad people. Some of the egregious acts that they enact include having a child with your partner without telling them the purpose of creating that child is ultimately to create another soldier in a space war, willfully condemning a friend to years of immobile solitary imprisonment due to a disagreement in beliefs, violently massacring countless individuals, and using his own child's body as a weapon to enact said violence, leaving who she considers to be her closest friends to deal with the aftermath of decades of rage from a genocidal empire simply because she did not feel like confronting her family, condemning the planet they claim to love and protect to years of battles and attacks from out-of-this-world creatures and aliens, largely due to them no longer being present to protect said planet once they leave for one reason or the other due to the consequences of their own actions. And bonus points, leaving your primary partner behind to raise your superhuman child alone, and even leaving behind a partner you view as inherently less important than your first partner, largely viewing them as more of a tool for your personal emotional growth than anything else. An oddly stacked voice cast. Like, the lineup for both of these shows in voice actors is incredibly impressive, and in my opinion, the voice acting is actually consistently one of the stronger things about both of these shows. So the beautiful thing about these two shows, Invincible, Steven Universe, is that yes, we are watching a literal epic story about space battles and aliens, but at the same time, we're also watching two shows that work phenomenally as conduits for themes that stand the test of time. Yeah, sure, one of them is primarily marketed towards children, but the battle between good and evil and learning how to fit in when you feel non-human amongst the rest of humanity, that's been around since literally forever. Invincible and Steven Universe are shows about being alien, yes, but in my opinion, very rarely are the stories we write actually only about what they're about. Let's use an incredibly simple story as an example. The itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain, and the itsy bitsy spider climbed up that spout again. Bars. I know. So these 4 sentences are about a spider, and they're about rain, and they're about a water spout and the sun. But what the itsy bitsy spider is actually about is perseverance. The fact that a teeny tiny minuscule little creature faces a task as great as climbing an entire water spout, something probably bigger than it can even conceptualize, to at least to the spider. And then a circumstance completely out of the spider's control occurs, and it impedes that task, that goal that the spider is trying to reach. Rain is an unfeeling, neutral thing. It has no concept of malice. It's not raining to purposefully impede the spider's journey, nor is it raining to necessarily help the spider. It's not like it's gonna, rain to hydrate the spider. Rain is just a thing that happens. It's simply falling, much like many circumstances and problems throughout our everyday lives kind of just simply happen. The universe really doesn't have a morality to itself like that. And then the rain, our problems, they come and they go. And then what follows is what always follows the rain, the hardship, the sun, better times. And the sun does what it does. It dries up the rain, just as goodness and growth often follow periods of hardship. And it all happens pretty unremarkably. It's just a cycle of things that occur, and the spider simply crawls up the water spout again Life is nothing but a series of waterspouts, followed by rain, followed by sun, followed by againness. And I gleaned all of that from just 4 sentences. It's not that I'm placing meaning where there is none, nor is it that every single story we tell is created with the intent of deeper meaning necessarily. Trust me, there are a lot of people out there who create stories and barely give it any thought as to what they mean. I am looking directly at you, Sam Levinson. What I mean by this is meaning, lesson, theme. These things are innate and intrinsic to storytelling. It's literally impossible to tell stories without, this kind of meaning being imbued into them. It's incredibly difficult to define what exactly makes a human human. Not necessarily biologically. Obviously, we know the difference between, a human and an elephant. But on a metaphorical sense, on a philosophical sense, defining what being human is incredibly challenging and difficult. I would argue that a search for meaning is one of the few things that we can point to that is uniquely and innately human, right? Because a spider spends no more time questioning its existence than an eagle. Humans are unique in their desire for why, and it most obviously shows when we tell stories.
There's nothing here but me. I'm just talking to myself. This is how I want you to be. But I don't know if this is who you really are. I've learned things about you.
Speaking of stories, one of my favorite stories in the whole world is a book called Ishmael, written by Daniel Quinn. The entirety of Ishmael is an examination and deconstruction of what it means to be human. It's an incredibly phenomenal political read, and it ultimately makes a fabulous environmentalist argument for why capitalism has got to go. The book follows an unnamed protagonist who finds an ad in a newspaper that reads, "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world. Apply in person." Upon going in person, protagonist realizes that the individual who published the ad is a gorilla, and this gorilla calls himself Ishmael. The entirety of the book is just a series of conversations between Ishmael and protagonist, and they detail Ishmael's life, philosophy, worldview. They discuss everything from the meaning of life to living under capitalism to environmentalism, and they spend an extensive amount of time exploring together the power of narrative and storytelling and the role that it plays in human life. There's one specific story that Ishmael and protagonist dissect together throughout the book, and perhaps to many people it might be considered the great story, at least in the eyes of Western culture. That story is the story of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. Ishmael argues that the story of Genesis did not actually occur in a literal sense, but instead argues that it is a great folktale style metaphor. Ishmael argues Adam, Eve, they were not actually singular real people, but rather they're representations or metaphors for larger cultural moments. A folktale. He's essentially arguing that it's more productive to view the Bible as a historical text similar to a folktale. For example, the story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, which, if you are not familiar with this story, Adam and Eve, the first 2 humans to ever be created, are living in a blissful garden of peace and harmony. There's a singular tree with a fruit of all-knowing knowledge, and kind of the only rule that Adam and Eve are given is don't eat that fruit. It's implied that as long as Adam and Eve don't eat the fruit, they can live in harmony with animals and nature forever in the Garden of Eden. Instead, Adam and Eve eat the fruit, thus condemning themselves not only to be exiled from this garden, but they no longer live in harmony with animals. I know that some renditions imply that they are also no longer privy to immortality, but that's up for debate, varying on the text you're reading. Essentially, in Ishmael's opinion, this story is not literally about eating an apple, but instead it's a representation for when humans culturally began to take into their own hands the decision of who lives and who dies. Because the apple in the text is symbolized as like the fruit of all knowledge, right? It essentially puts you on the same playing field as God, I suppose. So the eating of the forbidden fruit is really a representation of when man, the collective of man, decided to taste the forbidden fruit of defining what life means for all other life, to abandon living as we should in the Garden of Eden. It is a representation of abandoning living as one with nature as a whole and respecting the natural balance of life and where humans fall on, like, you know, a biological, ecological scale. And instead of living in harmony by eating the forbidden fruit, Ishmael argues that we have worked against our biological natures, cast ourselves out of the garden to try and define what life is meant to be outside of simple coexistence. To quote Ishmael directly, he says, "The disaster occurred when, 10,000 years ago, the people of your culture took into their own hands the power of life and death over the world. Have some of this fruit, and you'll instantly realize that you're naked to the world, powerless. Then lucky you can leave this garden and begin living by the sweat of your brow, the way humans are supposed to live." Now, Ishmael, of course, is saying this last part ironically, because when you view the story of Adam and Eve in this way, the decision to eat the forbidden fruit suddenly becomes a lot less like a moment of revelatory freedom and more like an active going against the very nature of our being. In this interpretation of story, if the Garden of Eden is representative of living in harmony with the earth, remaining true to our initial purpose to exist with the planet, then yes, absolutely. The revelation of the fact that we are naked and other from these creatures that we live on this planet with was an absolutely horrible, deliberate decision that we made. Hello, editing me, just adding further clarification here because it's interesting contextually for the video. So the reason why we culturally see Adam and Eve eating the apple as an overtly negative thing, like a poor decision to have been made, is because the Bible was presumably, like if we're viewing it from the perspective as a folktale, it was written by people who wish we hadn't made that choice to abandon our roots as like mammals and people who deserve to live in co-harmony with, the animals in the Garden of the Eden, the animals of Earth. And Ishmael in the book argues that if the Bible had been written by capitalists, the story of Adam and Eve potentially would have instead been viewed as a really good thing because it gave them a bunch of knowledge and they were able to stray from our seemingly underdeveloped perspective, which is just an interesting thing to add to the conversation there. That entire argument alone and that book could be an entirely separate video, so that's about the extent that I can go into it here because I will just go off on a side tangent. But the reason that I'm bringing this up, the reason why Ishmael has anything to do with this conversation we're having about Invincible and Steven Universe is because Ishmael is a story that's ultimately about stories. The power of how we use story and metaphor and narrative to grapple with the great narrative of being alive. The Bible, arguably, whatever your stance on it is undeniably one of the most influential written texts on the planet. And it makes a hell of a lot of sense when you view it as a story we tell to represent and grapple with themes of human existence. In a way, the Bible is no more narratively potent than the Itsy Bitsy Spider or Invincible or Steven Universe, because they are all just varied and different representations of challenging yet universally small, unique human struggles. Whether you see that as a positive or negative thing, they're all dressed in different ways, some longer than others, some culturally more impressive perhaps, but they're all ultimately the same stories, told over and over and over.
Why do I care about them? They were weak, short-lived, barely a species. They shouldn't matter to me.
That doesn't mean they should die.
You don't understand! I'm not supposed to feel this way! How is this better?
When a gem is made, it's for a reason. They burst out of the ground already knowing what they're supposed to be, and then that's what they are. Forever. But you're supposed to change. You're never the same, even moment to moment. You're allowed and expected to invent who you are. What an incredible power. The ability to grow up.
In my opinion, the show Invincible treats humanness as both an innate thing that someone can be and also something that can be taught. Humanness in the world of Invincible can be described by traits such as perseverance, a general respect of life and autonomy, the ability to specifically care for things that logically might be deemed as biologically weaker or lesser. And these traits in the show aren't just treated as innate to the species of human alone, but are found and assumed to be intrinsic to all life. We see a number of examples throughout the series of individuals and species who carry these traits, whether they interact with biological humans or not, thus meaning these characters are humanized. We are meant to see them as good because they are like us. Further, a character strays from these traits that I previously described, whether it be through an enjoyment of destruction of life, a belief some life is innately superior to others, a lack of respect for lesser creatures. These characters are seen as inhumane and narratively treated as such. Now, what makes for good storytelling is that there are moments, of course, where our innately human characters stray from what makes them human. They kill without looking for an alternative, or they act on behalf of an idea solely because they feel they are superior in that moment. We specifically see this a lot through Mark. The show Invincible treats these moments of non-humanness as Mark leaning into his Viltrumite side, his alien side. The vast majority of internal conflict that Mark struggles with has to do with moments where he strays from what he defines as traditionally human. It's a big struggle for his character, and it is hard for him to grapple with. And at the same time, because Mark's character is the one to be purported as primarily human, remember, Mark is the character under the column of fighting to remain human, whereas Omni-Man is fighting to become human. So because Mark's whole character arc is fighting to remain human, a lot of times when he breaks his humanness and he acts more like a Viltrumite, if it's not framed as an error or a slip-up, it's seen as a necessary, difficult, intentional dip into non-humanness, because sometimes shit just needs to get done. Whereas a character who would fall under the column of struggling to become human, like Omni-Man, when they slip up and lean into non-humanness, it's seen as a step backwards, reverting to what they are trying to avoid being. Which, it's incredibly interesting because, as I said, the show treats humanness as largely innate, and it implies that learning to be human is hard. Arguably harder than struggling to remain human. We see this through Debbie, for example, arguably the show's primary representation of the most human one can be. Side note, Debbie, my queen, my love, she's my favorite character ever. Debbie is positioned in the show as to what I would consider to be a center of gravity, or almost like a control group compared to the characters around her. Mark, Nolan, their representations of either becoming or remaining human, they always centrally come back to her. Whether their character growth is, tied by her direct teaching, or whether her influence is through her absence when a non-human leaning character has to decide to continue to make the human choice without her around. This supports my argument that the battle of becoming human is harder than remaining human, because Debbie, in all her humanness, is a driving force for those around her, whereas characters who I would argue are like her foils, for example, somebody like Thrag, who is as Viltrumite as it can get. Even Thrag is not immune to the tug and pull and difficulty of losing a little bit of his Viltrumite-ness, of feeling human feelings. Whereas for a character like Debbie, who is innately human through and through, there is never a struggle for her in, turning non-human. We see this in Steven Universe as well, where the gems, who are, I would argue, under the same column as Rose Quartz, struggling to become human, they only begin to really do so through the influence of the human characters around them. Without that catalyst, that journey is very difficult for them to make. It's easier for some than others, but ultimately it could be argued that narratively, they do need that catalyst there for that metaphorical transformation to be complete. So if humanness is so innate to some, why is it so hard to maintain for characters like Mark, or to become like characters such as Rose and Omni-Man? Well, it's similar to my referencing of the book Ishmael and how the story of Eden represents a larger human struggle. Mark, Omni-Man, Steven, Rose, they represent the parts of being human that we really, really struggle with. Ugly, internal, difficult to grapple with parts that are simultaneously so universal. We all have certainly experienced them before. And at the same time, internally, we feel that these things are so foreign and difficult. Surely we must have been the only people alive to ever feel this way. And okay, obviously, we're not taking it super literally, right? Like the majority of people, I hope, have not had to grapple with to kill or not to kill. But how many times have you laid awake at night feeling like you're doing the being alive thing wrong? How many times have you felt you just don't belong in your own skin? And surely everyone else out there got some handbook to doing the human thing right. And you must be from some alien planet, and there's something dirty and disgusting about you. And maybe actually this nasty thing inside you, this desire to dominate or take control or destroy, or even something as simple as the feeling of wanting to be superior, it actually is what's at your core. And it's something rotten. And no matter how hard you try, you're just never going to be able to undo it, because you are where you come from and you make and do what you know. Or maybe you also simultaneously know that you are good. You have to be good, right? Because wanting to be good is in itself a step in the right direction. You are good, God damn it. And even if you were set up not to be good, you're going to fight to be good and try with all your might to be good, because that's what being human is, to fight and push both ourselves and one another into making the world a better place, even if deep down inside you know, if you were even just a little bit lazier, a little more pessimistic, you know you would do the opposite, but you can't, you shouldn't, and you won't. This is why Steven Universe and Invincible are about aliens. Arguably, being human is nothing but the feeling of being foreign and alien. And it's somehow the thing that pushes us away from one another and simultaneously unites us. And unfortunately, we live in a world where people bit the apple. Circumstances and powers bigger than us made that choice without wondering how it would affect you and me. There are people out there who take matters of life and death into their own hands. We have real-world Diamond and Viltrumites. Now it's up to us, regular Marks and Stevens of the world, to not only clean up after their external mess, but also learn how to undo how all of that affected our own internal mess. Here's where we get into the tricky part. Despite the fact that I really enjoy both of these shows, there's one major bone I have to pick with each of them, and it is the same. They both have the same bone that I want to pick. Throughout Steven Universe, Steven's ability to forgive and reason with his enemies is portrayed as both a positive defining character trait of his and also one of his biggest flaws. Steve
Think, Mark!
Mark's empathy for others is used to deceive him numerous times. Sometimes his enemies take advantage of his kindness, and sometimes his kindness inadvertently ends up putting those he loves in danger. The primary antagonists of Invincible, Steven Universe, are by all accounts absolutely terrible, horrendous, awful people. The show is a cool animated show, of course, so sometimes they do get to do cool, fun musical numbers and moments of genuine intrigue and comedy. But if you write their actions plain on paper without the context of the show surrounding it, the Viltrumites are proud colonizers, blatantly overt in their belief of racial or species superiority, abusive diplomats that constantly show a lack of respect for life and their subjects, more often than not, extremely violent and imposing above all else, even to one another. Now, Steven Universe is ultimately a show about Mark, and the show is not primarily focused on exploring the intricate relationships between political tyrants and the people and institutions that are affected by them. We get a nod here and there acknowledging this kind of thing that I've mentioned, and it's certainly interesting to think about, but at least how the shows are put out and in the show creators' eyes, these themes are never the primary focus of the show. It's ultimately a cool story about learning how our protagonist comes to be with their powers and grapples with remaining human, which is challenging. A lot of people tend to say that Invincible is a show only concerned about forgiveness. And because of that, it really doesn't matter what kind of political implications the show has, because it's ultimately learning about how to forgive one another. And a lot of people think that Steven Universe is a show primarily marketed towards children, and therefore is focused on being comedic above all else, and so doesn't have a place to focus on its political implications, because that's not what the show is about. And as I said, as a viewer, for me personally, and I do know for many others, this can be challenging. It can be difficult to swallow when engaging with these objectively pretty good pieces of media. Because what happens is when you have these two stories that are primarily focused on forgiveness, you know, the shows and the creators of the shows, they're more concerned about interpersonal struggle than systemic struggle. Because on a thematic level, remember, these shows aren't actually about aliens, they're about us. So yeah, of course they're going to make it about forgiveness. Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be absolutely lovely that even at our worst, even when we fall from grace and stray from the most human parts of ourselves, we can learn again. We can become better. Sometimes it's grueling work, and a lot of the times people never fully forgive you, but it can happen. It has to happen, right? We are deserving of that. However, real life doesn't work that way. Real life events of human failure or immorality are not metaphors for what it means to be alive. They just are a part of being alive. So in fiction, yeah, we can entertain what happens when the man who kills 2,000 plus people begins to reform and change, because it's narratively engaging. And yeah, the tyrants that were fully okay with decimating an entire planet, they do have interesting backgrounds riddled with grief and complex familial relationships. But it's challenging because, let's call it what it is, real life supremacists, real life colonizers, real life abusers often can't or shouldn't be forgiven. And media doesn't exist in a bubble, right? I'm of the personal belief, and many others are as well, that engaging with art in a bubble, viewing it in a vacuum without considering how it relates to our real world experiences, it's not productive. It's just not the move. There are a lot of critiques directed towards both Invincible and Steven Universe due to the fact that the moral lesson of the show paints a picture that says everyone should be forgiven, which, particularly from the minority perspective, it's simply not the case when it comes to reality. And, you know, there are people that will go and say, well, these shows aren't about real life, they're fiction. So what if the lesson in the show is ultimately about forgiveness? We've established that stories are nothing but conduits for reality. They're how we cope with reality. Yes, Although it does make sense why we want to create pieces of fiction that, allow for circumstances where everybody can learn from their mistakes and everybody can be forgiven. It is perfectly valid and okay for people to look at those works and challenge them. And it's not advocating that works like that shouldn't exist, but it's also important to view everything we engage with a critical eye. You shouldn't be turn brain off, engage with what I view without thinking about it. Culture and media just don't work that way. There is no such thing as engaging with a piece of media without it affecting you in some way and without it relating to the real world in some way. That's kind of the whole point of viewing things from an intersectional lens. Now, there are moments in these shows, Invincible in particular, that support the case that there are just some people who can't or shouldn't be forgiven. Some people who have strayed so far from humanity, there's just no returning. Now, Steven Universe does a much worse job at, at least giving this point that I'm trying to make a nod in that direction. And okay, so at this point, if you're watching this video up to this point, I'm sure that my turning and critiquing the shows might seem a little antithetical to the point that I've been making this entire time. My claim up to this point is that stories about being alien are actually at their core stories about being human. The universal struggle of what it means to be alive, to engage with a moral compass, to feel ostracized, incomplete, foreign. So if this is the case, if my kind of thesis point is true, why wouldn't we want to forgive the big bad guys? If the big bads are representative of the worst parts of us, why shouldn't we create stories where they can change, grow, and learn? It's because the metaphor of feeling alien, the metaphor of being treated as alien, it is absolutely important to engage with thematically, and it makes for compelling story. But it is also a reality for a vast majority of people on the planet in real life. Entire races of people have been treated as non-human for a more substantial part of human existence than not. Categories of identity and culture have been colonized, murdered, destroyed, obliterated. If I looked my Boricua grandparents in the eye and said, I was watching a show about a group of people who believed they were superior to all beings they encountered, and they enacted mass genocide against all other people they encountered, largely because they believed they knew how to conduct life better. They would look me in my eye and say, why are you watching the American History Channel? It is absolutely glorious and wonderful to engage with storytelling from this, really hopeful and metaphorical lens that I have been for the majority of this video, that we tell stories to cope with how complicated real life is. And also, it's important to understand the impact of those stories in relation to the reality that we live. This isn't me at the end of this video turning around to claim that Steven Universe or Invincible are absolutely terrible shows. I have consistently said throughout this video, I enjoy these shows a lot. I'm a big fan. It does not make their storytelling less valuable. It is not a discrediting against the morality of the people who wrote these stories, but I also highly doubt that the creators of Invincible were thinking about abolitionist theory and reparations when they were writing a storyline about how hard it is for Omni-Man that people still haven't forgiven him for, all of that. And that's because, that too is representative of these stories being deeply human. In a way, my critique of, this flaw that I find with these stories proves my point even further, that people in general want to imagine a world where the bad guys see the error of their ways and learn from their mistakes. And it is, in fact, deeply human to write stories that perhaps are not intersectional in their storytelling, in the pursuit of, ignoring the bad to envision a better world. It doesn't make it right, I would say, but I would argue that it is deeply human to do that. I personally my opinion, I would find it a lot more interesting if these stories had explored otherwise. What would it look like for Steven to have rallied the gems on Homeworld into taking down the Diamond Authority in an act of true rebellion as opposed to negotiating and reasoning with their oppressor? What would it look like for the writers of Invincible to ensure that if Debbie didn't take Nolan back, he would be capable of understanding and grappling with the fact that he permanently altered and destroyed his relationship with someone in a way that can't and perhaps shouldn't be forgiven? And before anybody says it, no, just because Steven Universe is a children's show doesn't mean that it shouldn't perhaps include more complex themes. Children are incredibly capable of handling difficult narratives. And no, it is not the woke or overtly feminist take for Debbie to not want to stay with somebody who has a kill count in the 2000s.
What were you thinking shutting this operation down? It could have been great!
No, you're wrong!
What do you mean? It's perfect. Look at it.
We are looking at it.
Yeah, this plan stinks.
Completing this colony would have meant the extinction of all life on Earth.
But think of the good it would have done. The gems that would have been made, our empire expanded.
Rose Quartz believed all life was precious and worth protecting.
Well, if she wanted to protect it, she did a lousy job. There'd be no cluster if the Earth had stayed a colony. Now there's no colony, and there's gonna be no Earth, so thank you, Rose Quartz. You doomed the planet.
To be human is to feel alien. And stories about being alien and struggling with remaining or becoming human, these stories are about us, the collective us, the representation of humanity as a whole. And also from a certain political standpoint, certainly the political standpoint that I'm looking at these pieces of media with, rehabilitation, redemption, these are tools reserved for community building, for the everyday person, not for the colonizer or the oppressor. When you or I, the collective everyday person, engage with these stories as viewers or as writers even, we are the Marks, the Stevens of the world. The ways in which these two characters metaphorically represent very human and normal struggles, they are dramatized, they're symbolically turned into epic battles and horrible mistakes, and then they create engaging stories to be reckoned with. We want to see Mark become better despite going against his no-kill rule, because we want to imagine a world where we too can be better despite whatever personal moral fairings we ourselves have gone through. The Viltrumites of the world, the Diamonds, I'm of the belief they are fully alien. They're inhumane in a way that should be challenged, should not be forgiven. And there are plenty of stories out there that do show us examples of not forgiving the metaphorical Viltrumites in our world. Stories that show what happens when someone becomes too alien, too inhumane. Katniss, for example, kills Coin instead of President Snow. Aang takes away Ozai's bending permanently. Undeniably, Invincible and Steven Universe are, more often than not, really deeply relatable stories, arguably good stories. And I don't think that their mishandling of the supremacy of it all means that we should write these stories off entirely. A lot about these two shows that I'm referencing do critique the inhumanity, the alienness of their antagonists. The most likely explanation is Invincible and Steven Universe fall back into these tropes, the tropes that bad guys can learn lessons and good guys can teach them, because they're superhero shows, mainstream superhero shows with budgets and agents, and you know, they are not inherently radical pieces of work, I would say. And their creators were primarily focused with the metaphor of feeling alien and also telling cool stories about aliens. Which, yeah, it's tough, because my entire argument throughout this video is that all stories, no matter how complex or simple, from the Itsy Bitsy Spider to the Bible itself, stories are conduits for deep human theme and morality. So people who feel deeply alien, who feel fallible and immoral, they're going to write stories where the bad guys learn, even if I and many others prefer stories where we show sometimes that some people don't learn because it better reflects the truth of reality. And I don't know, again, I really do think that that might just be the most human quality of all, to stubbornly demand that we all strive to be and deserve to be seen and treated as human, while simultaneously existing in a world where a lot of people actually don't believe that. Or who knows? Maybe it's just a show about aliens and superheroes and powers.
Are the crystal
Mark!